By the time Daniel got the side clasps of Serel's armor open, the troop carrier was on its side, and the air smelled of hot metal, coolant, and antiseptic foam. "Don't move," he said, because it was what he always said when everything was already moving too fast. Serel's eyes found him in the emergency lights, bright cyan and steady in a face gone a shade paler under its muted green. Her braided hair had come loose at the temples. One of the thin, glowing lines along her cheek flickered once, then held. There was blood under the raised collar at her throat, not as much as there had been a minute ago, but enough to keep his pulse fast. "I had not planned to," she said. Even half crushed against a bulkhead with the carrier groaning around them, she sounded like herself. Dry, controlled, very nearly amused. It should not have helped. It did. Daniel slid 2 fingers carefully beneath the edge of her collar to check for a deeper bleed. Her skin was cool with shock, smooth under the grit and heat. Her breath caught, not from fear, he thought, but from the pressure, and his own almost stopped with it. "Look at me," he said. "I am looking." "No, really look." She did then, directly, not like a captain checking whether her medic had his head on straight, not like an officer measuring damage, like a woman in the wreck of a machine, with his hand at her throat and his knee between hers because there was nowhere else for either of them to be, deciding whether to trust him with the narrow space between pain and panic. He held up the seal patch. "You've got a laceration high on the shoulder line and probably bruised ribs. I don't think the shard went into the chest cavity. Good news for both of us." "You sound uncertain." "I'm a civilian who got dropped out of the sky with an alien combat unit. Uncertainty is kind of my brand." That brought it, the smallest curve at one corner of her mouth. It lasted less than a second. Daniel felt it like a hand to the sternum. Outside, something struck the hull. The carrier answered with a deep, ugly complaint. He slapped the patch over the worst of the bleeding, pressed, and counted without thinking. 1, 2, 3, 4. Serel's eyes narrowed. "Your numbers again." "Breathe in for 4, he said. "Hold for 4, out for 4. "You are giving me orders." "I'm giving you lungs." For the first time since impact, she obeyed without argument. Breath in, hold, out. He worked while she followed the count, sealing what he could, checking pupils, feeling for fractures through the segmented bronze panels and silver edges of her armor. The cyan triangle at her throat still glowed, dimmer than usual. He told himself he was focused on that because it was a useful indicator of perfusion in her species. He told himself several things in quick succession and believed none of them. 3 weeks ago, he had been standing in a transfer queue with a duffel bag, trying to buy passage to the nearest human consulate. Now he was kneeling over the captain of an all-female alien assault line, blood on his hands, wanting with a kind of terrified clarity to keep her alive. "Daniel," Serel said quietly. He looked up. If she noticed the strain in his face, she gave no sign of it. "You are hurt." He glanced down. A strip of skin along his forearm had been opened by a piece of shrapnel. He hadn't felt it. "Occupational hazard." "You do not have this occupation." "I keep meaning to mention that." Another impact sounded outside, farther off this time. Wind moved through a split seam in the hull, carrying dust with it. Serel's hand lifted, stopped. Then, with a decision he felt more than saw, she closed her fingers around his wrist. Not hard, just enough. "Stay with me," she said. The words should have belonged to him. They landed in him anyway. "I'm here," Daniel said. He had not planned to be. Not on this moon, not in this uniformless limbo, not in the company of women who looked at him as if he were an administrative error with a pulse. Certainly not here, with Serel's hand on him and all the careful distance of the last 3 weeks hanging by a thread. But he was here. And if this was the moment when everything finally broke, neither of them was going to meet it by pretending there was nothing between them at all. 3 weeks earlier, on Haldane transfer ring, Daniel Reyes had signed the wrong line on the wrong screen in the wrong language. He had been awake for 30 hours, living on coffee, machine crackers, and the stubborn hope that if he could just get off the freight lanes for a month, his life might stop trying to crush him into useful shapes. The salvage tug he'd been riding Medicon paper and General Dog's body in practice on had lost a contract and half its crew in orbit over a mining station whose owners believed safety briefings were a kind of decorative literature. Daniel had spent 2 days splinting wrists, decompressing tension, and keeping a driller with a punk. Toured lung alive until proper evac reached them. After that, he wanted a berth, a shower, and a government desk with a human being behind it. What he got was a translation kiosk in Concourse C, and a clerk drone that had clearly been designed by people who hated everyone equally. Temporary attachment for transit labor, the screen told him. "Sure," Daniel muttered. "Attach me to a mop if it gets me a seat." He selected medical support from the skill list, hit confirm, thumbed his ID to the pad, and moved on before the machine could find another form for him to ruin. 10 minutes later, a boarding tag printed from the wall slot beside him. He noticed the emblem first, a silver crescent laid over a line of small blue stars. Military. He almost handed it back before he saw the gate number. Same departure dock as the civilian shuttle, leaving in 14 minutes. "Fine," he told the universe. "Fine. Military shuttle, civilian shuttle, shuttle-shaped object, I'm not picky." He only started to understand the mistake when he walked into the embarkation bay, and every head turned. The women standing in the bay were not human. They were tall even out of armor, taller in it, their bodies built with the same elegant efficiency their machines seemed to prefer. Muted green skin in shades from pale olive to darker moss. Long pointed ears laid close to their heads or angled with alertness. Hair braided back from the face in styles that seemed practical first and beautiful by accident. Their armor, silver, gunmetal, dark bronze with quiet cyan light in the seams, made the whole bay look like an altar to precision. And in the center of them stood the woman who would, against all sensible predictions, ruin his life in ways he would later consider a blessing. Serel's armor was more ornate than the others, not by much. Her shoulder plates were broader, her collar higher, her stance the still point around which the rest of the room arranged itself. Her face was slightly angular, composed without being cold. The thin, luminous markings at the outer corners of her eyes caught the bay light when she turned. Her hair had been woven in dozens of narrow braids from brow to scalp, all gathered into a coiled braided spiral at the back of her head, with several long braids trailing down between her shoulders. It was a severe style until you noticed the care in it. She looked at Daniel's tag, then at Daniel, then back at the tag. "No," she said. Daniel almost laughed from relief. "Great, glad we agree." One of the women beside her, older and wider through the shoulders, took the tag and scanned it. "Attached auxiliary," she said. "Medical support. Registered to 3rd Line Spear, Captain Serel commanding." "That," Daniel said, pointing at the tag as if someone else had printed it, "is not what I meant to do." The older woman's mouth twitched. Administrative systems often act on meanings no one intended. "I was trying to get to the human consulate." Serel extended her hand. He gave her the tag. Her fingers were long, armored only at the knuckles, her nails cut short and practical. She read in silence. "The ship departs in 6 minutes," she said. "Perfect. Plenty of time to fix this." "It would have been yesterday." Daniel blinked. "That's not how minutes work." A siren sounded in the bay. Cargo clamps disengaged somewhere above them with a concussive thud. The older woman, later he would know her as Ruzel, sergeant of the line and owner of the driest humor in 3 systems, inclined her head toward the boarding ramp. "Captain." Serel looked once toward the dockmaster station, shuttered and dark behind a sheet of armored glass, then back at Daniel. "What medical training do you have?" "Certified paramedic, emergency patch work, basic trauma stabilization, some field surgery assistance if the surgeon is better than me and not dead." "You speak Galen trade well enough to understand orders." "Well enough to misunderstand them catastrophically, apparently." The corner of Ruzel's mouth moved again. Serel did not smile. "Aboard," she said. Daniel stared at her. "As what?" Serel handed back his tag. "As my problem." That was how he joined the 3rd Line Spear of the Areli Frontier Guard. Not with an oath, not with a weapon, but with a clerical error, and a woman who had more urgent things to do than untangle it. By the time the troop cutter cleared the ring and jumped for the frontier moon of Sareth Vale, Daniel had been issued a bunk, a translator patch with terrible opinions about human names, and a unit briefing that explained why every soldier on board besides him was female. The Areli Line companies, Ruzel told him in the tone of someone reciting facts to a child with a head injury, were kin-structured military houses. Daughters trained together, served together, and inherited command through maternal lines when peace allowed such things to matter. Men served elsewhere, mostly in engineering fleets, administra, Tian and home defense. It was history, biology, logistics, culture, and about 6 other reasons Daniel was too tired to absorb. "What I'm hearing," he said, "is that I am not standard equipment." "What you are," Ruzel said, "is attached support." "I don't want to alarm you, Sergeant, but I'm not very attached." Ruzel looked him over. That may become clear in battle. Serel kept him because the company had lost its last medic on the previous rotation, and because no one else on the cutter knew what to do with a human civilian in transit, while a border insurgency was trying to set half the moon on fire. She kept him at a distance because she was sensible. Daniel discovered this within the first day. Captain Serel did not waste words. She did not tolerate sloppiness. She had a habit of listening so completely that answering her felt like stepping onto tested ice. She expected her line to polish kit, memorize routes, and tie down every loose strap before sleep. She expected Daniel to stay clear of combat unless ordered to triage casualties. She also, annoyingly, turned out to be right about almost everything. The attraction arrived before he had language for it. Not in a cinematic flash, not because she was beautiful, though she was. It came in increments. The way she lowered her body to speak to wounded troopers HFY. The way she never asked anyone to do what she would not do herself. The way she placed 2 fingers against the cyan pulse point at the base of a soldier's throat before every drop. A brief, private ritual of checking and counting. He knew enough by then to understand that in Areli custom, touch was economical, functional, not cold but intentional, nothing casual about it. Which meant he probably should not have noticed how carefully Serel never touched him at all. By the 5th day on Sareth Vale, the line went out under fire. The insurgents on the moon favored ambushes and old mining tunnels, which meant crumbling stone, unstable scaffolds, and the kind of sharp metal debris Daniel had spent years acquiring professional disdain for. He was stationed in the rear of a canyon relay post with 2 med crates and instructions not to be heroic. Then Linu came in half-carried between 2 troopers, blood slick over one armored thigh where a fragment had punched through the seam above the plate. Daniel didn't think, he moved. Pressure here, he snapped at the trooper on Linu's left, guiding her hand 3 centimeters inward. Not there, there. Linu bared her teeth. I can walk. You can bleed, Daniel said. Lie down and disappoint me later. He cut the damaged armor strap, found the wound, packed it, and rapped hard while Linu swore in Areli and something that might have been a prayer. His translator patch gave up entirely. Someone knelt opposite him and braced Linu's leg steady with capable hands. Serel. Daniel registered the polished edge of her shoulder plate, the glow from the collar at her throat, the fact that her gaze was on his hands and not his face. Will she keep the limb? She asked. Yes, if everyone here stops trying to be brave in ways that are medically stupid. Linu made a strangled laugh. Daniel tightened the dressing. Look at me, he told her. Breathe in for 4. Linu's eyes went wide. What? In for 4, hold out for 4, do it. She obeyed because pain made good followers and because Serel, still bracing the leg, said in a level voice, do as he says. Daniel counted them through it while he finished the pressure rap. In, hold, out, hold. When he checked the bleed again, it had slowed enough to trust transport. Only then did he realize Serel's bare fingers were resting across the back of his hand, where they had both reached for the same bandage roll. Neither of them moved at first. Then Serel took her hand away. Linu was transferred to the proper field clinic an hour later with her pulse stable and her sarcasm intact. Daniel scrubbed up at an outdoor sink rigged from a fuel drum and 2 hoses. His hands shook once the adrenaline started to burn off. It always happened after, not during, never during. "You count to regulate breathing," Serel said behind him. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. She had removed her helmet. The evening light made the cool undertone in her skin more apparent and turned the cyan markings at her temples to something almost delicate. "It helps," he said. "Pain, panic, shock gives the body something simple to obey. It is not standard Areli practice." "I noticed your standard Areli practice was mostly glaring at people until they stopped bleeding." One thin brow lifted. "And yet you remain alive." "Barely." She stepped closer, not enough to crowd him, enough that he could see the individual braids at her hairline, tight and flawless. "Linu asked for you when the transport left." "Probably to complain." She said your voice made the pain easier to follow. Daniel looked back at the water running pee. Ink over his hands. "That's basically my business model." Silence settled between them, not empty. Serel watched the water, then the tremor in his fingers. "Your hands do not shake while you work," she said. "Bad timing if they did." "But after?" "After is when your body remembers you're not made of wire." Serel considered that useful. "For who?" "For a captain." Her gaze lifted to his face, knowing when strength costs. That might have been the first moment Daniel understood how dangerous she was going to be to him. Not because she was severe, because she saw. The next week gave him too many opportunities to prove he deserved his accidental birth. He stitched a scalp wound in a dust storm while the line held a ridge. He talked a trooper through a dislocated shoulder until Ruzel could reset it with a single brutal pull. He inventoried med gel, bandages, seal patches, analgesics, and the Areli equivalent of stimulant packs, then reorganized the crates because whoever had packed them originally ought to have been denied access to containers for life. Ruzel caught him halfway through and folded her arms. "You are making a mess." "I'm making it so I can find the chest seals before the tourniquets and not after them." Ruzel regarded the open crates. "Why these colors?" Daniel held up the rolls of tape he'd scavenged from maintenance. "Red, yellow, green, black." "Triage categories," he said. "Immediate, delayed, minor, expectant." Ruzel's expression flattened slightly on the last word. Daniel more gently said, "It's for when you have more wounded than hands. You mark who needs intervention now, who can wait, who can walk, and who," he shrugged once, "who you can't save with what you have." Ruzel did not look away, and humans make this choice with colors. Humans make this choice, however we can stand to make it. That night in the mess shelter, Serel sat opposite him with a metal cup of bitter leaf infusion steaming between her hands. The rest of the line were cleaning kit or sleeping. Wind pulled at the outer canvas. "You sort the living into probabilities," she said. Daniel, who had thought she was reading a roster, looked up. "That's one way to say it." Is there another? He leaned back on the bench. Not a nicer one. Serel set her cup down. Tell me. So he did. Not like a lecture. Not because she was a captain asking for procedure. Because she asked the way some people opened a door and then stood aside. He told her about ambulance work on Luna docks and freighters. About the rule that you checked airway first because oxygen deprivation would kill faster than a broken bone, no matter how ugly the bone looked. About packing a wound and elevating a limb, and why you treated for shock even when the bleeding had stopped, because the body was slow to believe the danger was over. About the cold arithmetic of limited supplies, and the shame that could sneak into a healer's sleep if he let it. Serel listened with her chin slightly lowered, eyes intent. When he finished, she said, "Our medics are taught not to count the lost after battle until all living are stabilized." That sounds wise. It is survival. Her fingers touched the rim of her cup. I count later. Something in the way she said it made him imagine her alone with a roster, reading names into silence so they did not disappear too quickly. Daniel looked down at his own untouched drink. That's also survival. For a moment, the noise of the shelter seemed to recede. Then Serel said very quietly, "Show me the breathing pattern." He laughed once under his breath. "Now. You prescribe it often." "I do not prescribe it. I strongly suggest it to stubborn people." Her gaze held his, "Then suggest it to me." So he set down his cup and said, "All right, sit back." Oh, she did. "In through the nose for 4, he said. "Not too deep, just steady. Hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. He counted, she followed. At the second round, the hard line of her shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. At the third, she opened her eyes and found him watching. Daniel forgot what number came next. Serel's mouth moved, the shadow of a smile not quite allowed to exist. "You have lost the count." "Occupational hazard," he said. "Of this occupation." He looked at her, at the lamplight on the silver edge of her collar, at the faint pulse of cyan at her throat. "No," he said, "a newer one." Ruzel interrupted them by dropping onto the bench with enough force to rattle the cups. "The captain is due at tactical review," she said blandly, "unless respiration has become a command matter." Serel stood with the smooth economy of someone who had never once fumbled for composure in her life. "It may be," she said, "if the line intends to keep using its lungs." Ruzel's eyes went to Daniel's face, then to Serel's, then back again. Daniel had the distinct and unpleasant sensation of being seen by a sergeant who missed nothing and gossiped only when it could do structural damage. After Serel left, Ruzel sipped from her own cup and said, "You should be careful." Daniel stared at her. That felt pointed. "It was meant to." "She's my commanding officer." "Yes." "I'm an attached civilian." "Yes." "I assume there's a regulation about this." "There are several. Some even have subclauses." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Great." Ruzel drank. "Good, you understand the terrain." The moon's northern flats were all stone and weather, and long distances that lied about themselves. When the storm hit 2 days later, it came down out of a yellow sky so quickly the recon team barely made the emergency blind before the world disappeared into grit. Daniel slammed the hatch with his shoulder and leaned against it, coughing dust out of his teeth. Inside the shelter, light came from a single battery lamp and the low blue pulse of equipment on standby. It was a space built for 4. They had entered it as 3, but the third, a scout with a minor concussion, had been evac'd by drone before the winds got bad enough to jam the air. Now it was just Daniel and Serel, which would have been fine if Serel had not braced one hand against the wall a little too carefully the second time the shelter shook. Daniel turned. "You're hurt." "I am functional." "That's not the same thing." She would have brushed him off, he thought, if they had been anywhere else. In front of the line, in the field, in any place where captaincy required the performance of being larger than pain. In a storm shelter the size of a freight locker, with the wind roaring at the walls, she only said, "It is the ribs, the impact from the crawler turn." "Sid." Her eyes narrowed. "Please," he amended. That got him farther. Serel lowered herself onto the fold-down bench with a measured breath. Daniel set down the med kit between them and knelt, because there was no room not to. He unsealed the side of her armor, eased off the left shoulder section, and watched the muscle in her jaw tighten when the weight shifted. "Tell me where," he said. She touched 2 fingers just below the line of her breastplate, more to the side than center. He looked at the point and then at her face. "I'm going to need access under the plating." "I had assumed you intended telepathy." He almost smiled. "You joke when you're trying not to hiss." "I do not hiss." "Serel." Something passed through her gaze then, something like surrender but not weakness. Consent, trust, chosen in full knowledge of what it cost them both. "Proceed," she said. He slid the undersuit panel aside only as far as necessary, found the swelling at the lower ribs and palpated carefully for instability. No crepitus, no obvious displacement. She sucked in a breath through her teeth anyway. "Bruised, maybe cracked," he said. "No sign of a flail segment, lucky." "Is that the medical term?" "It's the one patients get." He wrapped a compression band around her torso, angled to leave room for full expansion, and checked that she could still breathe without sharp catching. His knuckles brushed the smooth cool of her skin once, twice. Each accidental contact felt deliberate after the fact. "Too tight?" he asked. "No." "Again." "No." He sat back on his heels. Outside, the storm threw itself against the blind hard enough to hum through the metal struts. Serel was watching him. Not his hands this time, him. "Your pulse is elevated," she said. "You noticed." "I notice many things." He gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "That's one of your more alarming qualities." She tilted her head. "And yours." Daniel started to answer lightly, then didn't. The shelter was too small for lies that useless. "I keep functioning," he said, "usually right up until it's no longer required." Serel's gaze moved to his hands, where they rested on his thighs, fingers flexing once as the delayed tremor finally arrived. Not violent, just the fine shake he hated because it always felt like exposure. "You stabilize others," she said. "Who stabilizes you?" He looked away. "No one," was the honest answer. Not since his mother died. Not since a string of jobs had taught him the economy of being the calm one. Not since he'd learned that competence was a kind of currency, and that men who looked tired were often handed more weight instead of less. Before he could convert any of that into something safe, Serel reached for him. She took his wrist exactly as he had taken hers in the wreck, fingers light over the pulse. The contact was so gentle it undid him more effectively than if she had clutched. "You count for the wounded," she said. "I can count for you." Daniel forgot briefly how to breathe at all. Her thumb rested just below the heel of his hand, not stroking, not lingering, simply there where both of them could feel the beat under skin. "1," she said, voice low. "2, 3, 4. He met her eyes. The storm made a verse around them, and the lamp threw shadows under the strong line of her cheekbones and along the braided architecture of her hair. She looked nothing like any woman he had ever known, and exactly like the shape of trouble he would choose if given time to think. "You shouldn't do that," he said quietly. "I know." She did not let go. Daniel swallowed. "This is the part where I mention regulations." "This is the part," Serel said, "where we endure them." Then, because she was either merciful or wiser than he was, she released his wrist and leaned back against the shelter wall, as if her own pulse had not changed at all. When the storm broke 3 hours later, Daniel stepped out into a world scoured clean and felt as if he had left something vital in that shelter with her. Word traveled fast through the third-line spear, though no one said anything directly. Linu healed enough to walk with only a slight stiffness and developed an infuriating habit of grinning at Daniel whenever Serel addressed him by name. Ruzel became even drier, which Daniel had not considered possible. The line's troopers stopped calling him attached support and started calling him medic, which should not have mattered as much as it did. Then came the memorial. They had lost 2 soldiers in a tunnel collapse south of the Ridge batteries. Not dramatic deaths, not noble ones. Stone and bad air and timing. The worst kinds, Daniel thought, because they felt like insult as much as grief. At dusk the company gathered in a circle outside the command shelter. No speeches, no banners. Each woman stepped forward in turn, touched her wrist to the wrist of the next, and spoke a name. A chain of memory, body to body. Daniel stayed at the edge. He was not kin. He was not line. He had no place in it. Then Serel, standing at the head of the circle, looked at him. "Daniel Reyes," she said in Galen trade, so no translator had room to betray her meaning. "Step forward." Every face turned. He did, because when a captain called your name in front of the dead, you did. Serel held out her arm. For one absurd second he wondered if he had misunderstood the custom so badly. He was about to disgrace himself in 3 languages. Then Ruzel said from somewhere behind him, not unkindly, wrist to wrist medic. Daniel laid his wrist against Serel's. Her skin was cool from evening air. The cyan at her pulse point glowed softly where the edge of her collar left it bare. The contact was brief, formal. Nothing about it felt small. Serel spoke the first lost trooper's name. The chain moved on. When it ended, no one remarked on what she had done. No one needed to. She had made him visible in a way that could not be mistaken for clerical error. Later, as the company dispersed, Daniel found Serel alone by the outer lights. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she said, "I chose to." He looked at her profile against the dark. Why? At first he thought she would give him a captain's answer. Morale, merit, unit cohesion. Instead she said, "Because you belong among those who kept my line alive." The words hit harder than praise should have. Daniel leaned against the support post beside her, careful not to touch. That was either very kind or very reckless. Serel turned her head. The glow from the perimeter lamps caught in her eyes until they seemed lit from within. "Those are not opposites," she said. "The mission that broke them open began as an evacuation." A mining observatory on the far edge of Sareth Vale had gone dark after insurgents took out its relay mast. The settlement attached to it housed technicians, families, and 32 children old enough to know what artillery sounded like. Third-line Spear was sent to bring them out before the insurgents could turn the tunnels beneath the observatory into a grave. They landed under smoke. Daniel spent the first 10 minutes inside the nearest shelter sealing a boy's forearm fracture and explaining to a grandmother, through translation lag, that no, he was not a doctor, yes, he was a medic, and yes, he understood that from her point of view this might be a distinction without a difference if he did his job properly. Then the second bombardment hit. The troop carrier took the blast on the port side while they were loading the last civilians. Daniel remembered the lurch, the scream of metal, a child crying out in a language his patch did not know. Then impact and dark and Serel shouting orders over the collapse. And then the wreck, her blood under his hands, her fingers closing on his wrist. By the time he got her upright and half out of the twisted troop bay, the wind had risen and communications were patchy with jamming. The survivors split by necessity, Ruzel taking the civilians and ambulatory wounded toward a fallback beacon, Daniel keeping Serel moving toward the old telescope dome because it was the closest structure with intact walls. "I can walk," Serel said after the first 50 meters. "You're doing a really convincing impression of it." Dust stung Daniel's face. He had one arm around her back beneath the loosened armor, careful of the ribs, and every few steps she tried to take more of her own weight. Pride might be universal after all. At the dome entrance she stopped abruptly, catching herself on the frame. "Breathe," Daniel said at once. Her laugh was faint and unsteady. "You are relentless." "It's one of my softer qualities." Inside, the old observatory was cold and mostly dark. The great telescope itself had been stripped years ago, leaving only the circular chamber and the half-open roof segments above. Through them, Evening showed in a hard scatter of unfamiliar stars. Daniel got Serel onto a maintenance cot, checked the seal patch, retaped the shoulder where dust had started to compromise adhesion, and finally let himself sit back. For a minute, neither of them spoke. The quiet after emergency was always strange to him, not peaceful, more like the echo of something the body kept expecting and could not find. Sarah watched him with unreadable focus. "Your side?" she asked. Daniel looked down at the half-dried blood on his sleeve and remembered his own arm again. Still attached. That was not the question. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage one-handed. The cut was ugly but shallow. Serel held out her hand. "Give me the seal tape," she said. He did. "You do not know how to use." "Daniel." Something about hearing his name in that tone, quiet, absolute, made him fall silent. Serel cleaned the cut with more care than he had given himself all day. Her fingers were precise even with pain tightening her shoulders. When she pressed the dressing into place, her mouth set slightly, as if concentration could keep the world arranged. "You delayed correcting my papers," he said before he could stop himself. Her hand paused on his arm. It was not an accusation. It wasn't even a fully formed thought. Just the truth as it had finally assembled itself from scraps. The unfiled transit request, the vanished notices, the way his temporary attachment had kept extending without any clerk ever appearing to clean up the mess. Serel did not look away. "Yes," she said. Daniel should have felt anger, at minimum indignation. Instead, he felt a dangerous burst of warmth low in his ribs. How many times? "Twice." "That seems specific." "The third time," she said, smoothing the edge of the dressing against his skin. "You stopped asking when your transfer would clear." He breathed out slowly. Fair, entirely fair. Above them, through the broken roof, a meteor or debris trail cut briefly across the sky. Daniel said, "I had a bad feeling I was getting attached." Serel made the softest sound, not quite a laugh, not quite the breath before one. "You choose foolish moments for humor." "I'm aware." Her hand was still around his forearm. She seemed aware of it too. Her thumb rested against the inside of his wrist, right over the pulse she had counted in the storm shelter. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. "On my world," she said, "there is an old command law. It says a captain must never take what her line cannot afford to lose." Daniel looked at her face, at the control holding every feature in place. "And what does it say about asking?" "It assumes discipline will make the question unnecessary." Outside, distant concussions rolled over the flats, not near enough to move, near enough to remind. Daniel could have made it easy. He could have said they should wait, or that this was shock talking, or that there were rules and wars and a dozen practical reasons not to step wrong now. Instead, he heard himself say, "Do you want to ask?" For the first time since he had known her, Serel seemed uncertain. Not weak, uncertain in the way of someone standing before a threshold she has measured 100 times and still cannot predict from which side of it life will look different. "Yes," she said. The word landed between them with the force of chosen truth. Daniel's throat tightened, then asked. Serel's gaze dropped once to his mouth and returned. The thin cyan markings beside her eyes were very bright. "If I close this distance," she said, "will you regret it when morning brings consequence?" He could not tell whether the shaking in him was fear, relief, or desire stripped of places to hide. "No," he said, "not in the morning, not later." Something in Serel eased then, not her posture, something deeper. She lifted her hand from his wrist to his face, fingertips brushing the line of his jaw with such care it felt almost reverent. Daniel turned into the touch before he had time to decide not to. Their kiss was not reckless. That was what undid him. No collision, no desperate claim. Just the slow, unmistakable closing of the space they had been guarding for weeks. Her mouth soft and deliberate against his hand settling at her waist where the R. More had opened, careful of bruises. Her breath catching once, not in pain, and his answering before sense could intervene. When they parted, it was only far enough to look. Serel's pupils had widened. Her voice, when it came, was low and unsteady in a way he had never heard from her. "Again," she said. He kissed her again. Later, when the temperature dropped and the rescue beacon still had not answered, Daniel lay beside her on the narrow maintenance cot because the observatory had no other heat source, and because pretense had become insult. Serel's head rested against his shoulder, her braids smelling faintly of clean metal and wind-blown dust. His hand stayed over hers on the blanket between them, their fingers threaded not out of urgency, but because not touching had finally become the more difficult thing. At some point, he counted them both into sleep. Rescue came at dawn. Ruzel entered first with 2 troopers and one sharp look that told Daniel exactly how little escaped her notice. Commander Serel came in behind her, brigade command, silver-haired, scar along one ear, expression carved from old law. Her gaze moved from Serel's loosened armor to Daniel on the cot, and stopped there long enough to freeze the air. No one said anything in front of the others. They did not need to. By midday the civilians were en route to safety, the wounded redistributed, and Daniel was standing before Commander Serel outside the field command shelter with his med pack at his feet. "You rendered effective aid under fire," Serel said. "Your conduct during evacuation is noted." "Thank you. You are also an attached civilian who entered a commander's private shelter overnight while under her direct authority." Daniel kept his face still. There was a storm, she was wounded. "And in the observatory." He said nothing. Serelen's eyes narrowed slightly. "You understand the issue?" "Yes." "Captain Serel is under review for promotion to wing command after this campaign. Any suggestion that her judgment is compromised by attachment to support personnel endangers not only her standing, but the cohesion of every line beneath her." Every word was measured, every word true. Serel gestured toward the transit pad beyond the ridge. "A convoy leaves for the human enclave at dusk. Your transfer has been corrected. No stain will attach to Captain Serel if you depart now, and this matter ends with logistics. Daniel stared at the hard-packed earth between his boots. Here it was, then, the cost made visible. A month ago he would have grabbed the berth and thanked every god that had ever ignored him. A week ago he might have managed bitterness. Now all he could think of was Serel in the observatory dawn, her hand over his on the blanket, asking a question discipline had failed to kill. "If I go," he said, "she keeps the promotion. If nothing further occurs." Daniel nodded once. Salen watched him a moment longer. "Humans are spoken of as adaptable," she said. "I begin to understand why." After Salen dismissed him, Daniel found Serel by the vehicle yard, checking manifests with the rigid focus of someone refusing to be found by her own thoughts. He stopped 2 meters away. "That was fast," she said without looking up. "Your commander is efficient." Now she looked at him. There were no other people close enough to hear, but Serel still kept her voice level. "You are being transferred." "Yes." For one suspended moment he thought she might ask him to stay anyway. Not as captain, not as anything defendable. Instead, she set the manifest slate down on the hood of the crawler between them. "I will not ask you to make a sacrifice and call it freedom," she said. Daniel laughed once, broken at the edges. "You really know how to make a man miss you before he's gone." Something flashed in her face then, pain, anger, wanting. Real enough that it made him take half a step toward her before stopping himself. Serel drew a breath, held it, let it out. The pattern, 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. He loved her a little for using it. He hated that he knew what it meant. "You should go," she said. "So should you," he said. "You've got a command to keep." Her chin lifted a fraction. "And you have a life that should not be spent as an administrative accident." The convoy siren sounded from the lower pad. Daniel looked at her one last time, trying and failing to memorize less than everything. "Take care of your ribs. Take care of your impossible people." He smiled despite himself. "That's just me." "Daniel." He waited. Serel's eyes moved over his face as if she were committing it to a place no regulation could search. "Mourning brought consequence," she said quietly. "I do not regret." His chest hurt with the force of what he could not answer without breaking open where he stood. Then he picked up his med pack and walked away. He made it as far as the convoy gate before the first casualty transport from the northern B. Reach came in hot. The lead carrier skidded sideways on one damaged runner. Its rear hatch blew open before the vehicle fully settled, and wounded spilled into the dust in a mess of stretchers, shouted coordinates, and the unmistakable metallic smell of fresh blood. Someone yelled for medics. Daniel stopped walking. 2 field clinicians ran toward the transport. 4 more wounded were visible behind them. Then 6. Then more. Too many. Salen's final offensive on the insurgent jammer nest had gone bad, and the aid station ahead was a pair of modular tents and a prayer. Daniel dropped his duffel. By the time anyone thought to order him away, he was already at the rear hatch. "Walking wounded to the green tarp," he shouted, grabbing a roll of bright tape from the open med crate. "If you can hear me and breathe, move now. Pressure on your own wounds. Don't make me come get you." The nearest trooper blinked at him, dazed, then obeyed. Daniel slapped green tape on one shoulder, yellow on another. One red, another red. "You," he barked at a supply clerk frozen beside the ramp. "Hold this dressing here. Harder. Yes, you want her to complain." A stretcher came down bearing Commander Serel with a burn across one side of her neck and blood soaking the edge of her chest plate. Conscious. Pale. "Well," Daniel said, "this is awkward." Serel looked at him once and, to her credit, did not waste time on rank. Within minutes, the yard reorganized around his voice. Human triage was brutally simple, which was its gift. Tag, sort, stop the worst bleeding, open the airway, treat shock, use anyone with hands. He turned cooks into runners, mechanics into litter teams, one terrified civilian boy into the keeper of the red tape roll, because the kid needed a job more than reassurance. He showed an Areli gunner how to improvise a chest seal from patch film and clean plastic. He tied a tourniquet high on a shattered arm and talked the patient through the shaking. He counted breaths. He made people answer to their names. By the time the second carrier came in, Ruzel found him half-kneeling in dust beside a trooper with abdominal trauma and handed him fresh gloves without comment. "Where is Serel?" Daniel asked. Ruzel's jaw hardened. "Northern breach." Alive then, or Ruzel would have sounded different. "He comes." Intermittent. "The line is pinned near the jammer trench." Daniel tied off the dressing and stood. "They're going to have more wounded than they can move." "Yes." He looked toward the row of evac crawlers at the edge of the yard, back at Ruzel. "I need a driver." Ruzel stared at him. "You are no longer attached to my captain's unit." "Then this is incredibly generous of me." For the first time in his acquaintance with her, Ruzel gave him something almost like a grin. Brief, dangerous. "I will drive," she said. They loaded the crawler with med packs, seal patches, plasma, splints, 3 stretcher boards, and one very angry field clinician who kept muttering that none of this was authorized. Daniel invited him to complain after survival. The northern breach was a scar in the red stone, where the insurgents had embedded the jammer array in an abandoned excavation trench. Smoke hung low. Rifle fire cracked from the ridge. Ruzel got them in under cover of 2 burned-out haulers and a line of shattered retaining walls. Daniel hit the ground running. He found Serel where he should have known he would, at the forward position, half-crouched behind a barrier plate, issuing fire corrections with one hand pressed to the side of a trooper whose leg was laid open from knee to calf. Her own armor was streaked with dust and blood. The wrap Daniel had given her was visible for an instant through a split seam at the ribs. She looked up at the sound of his boots. For a heartbeat, the battlefield narrowed to the shock in her face. Then it hardened into fury. "What are you doing here?" "Your breathing exercise didn't really take," Daniel said, dropping beside the wounded soldier. "Move your hand 2 centimeters left. Good, keep pressure there." Serel stared at him, as if she might personally kill him once the insurgents failed. You left. I noticed. This position is not secure. Also noticed. Ruzel slid in behind them with the stretcher board and said, in the tone of someone discussing weather, "He is difficult to evacuate from a place once he has decided to improve it." Serel shut her eyes for half a second, opened them. Whatever she meant to say next vanished when incoming fire hit the barrier and the trooper under her hand cried out. Daniel worked. The line buckled twice and held. He stabilized 6 wounded under partial cover, taught 2 riflewomen how to hold cervical alignment on a concussed scout, and used the last of the red tape before he started tearing strips from a ration wrapper with his teeth. Then the jammer array blew. Not from artillery, from inside. A human demolitions tech, Daniel would learn later, had crawled a service culvert no Areli thought a grown body could fit through and planted charges by hand because the drones kept being shot down. Humanity, it turned out, had a long tradition of looking at terrible ideas and deciding they were at least worth trying once. The blast knocked everyone flat. Then the trench went quiet except for ringing ears and the settling groan of cracked metal. Third-line spear rose first. Of course it did. Serel pushed herself up on one knee, shouted the advance, and her company moved like the single mind he had always suspected command wanted but rarely achieved. Controlled, ruthless, exact. Daniel watched them go and understood with sudden clean certainty what everyone meant when they talked about glory. Not medals, not speeches. This, the stubborn insistence of living people on dragging one another home. By sunset, the jammer nest was taken. By full dark, the casualty numbers were lower than anyone had feared at noon, and Salem, burned, stitched, and very much alive, sent for Daniel again. This time, the meeting took place in the command shelter with Ruzel present, Serel at rigid attention, and enough official tension in the air to seal hull fractures. Salem regarded them both. The offensive succeeded, she said, in part because a civilian en route to transfer disobeyed orders reorganized my aid station and returned to the breach. Daniel opened his mouth. Salem lifted a hand. Do not apologize, it would waste everyone's time. Ruzel coughed once into her fist, which Daniel suspected concealed satisfaction. Salem continued, Captain Serel, your conduct regarding attached support remains improper. Serel's face gave nothing away. Yes, Commander. Your operational judgment today remains exemplary. Yes, Commander. Salem looked at Daniel. And you, Mr. Reyes, are inconvenient. Story of my life. Something almost human crossed Salem's expression and disappeared. There is an old line statute, she said, rarely invoked. It permits an outsider who preserves the fighting strength of a company under direct fire to be offered standing service within that company, subject to acceptance by its captain and sergeant. Daniel blinked. Ruzel folded her arms, looking deeply unsurprised. Salem went on. Standing service regularizes authority. It also makes the outsider subject to line law, duty rotation, campaign risk, and a minimum 5-year term. There it was, the cost named cleanly. No easy berth to a consulate. No slipping away when the fighting moved somewhere uglier. Years, not weeks. A life bent permanently around a decision. Serel turned to Serel. If you accept him into standing service, you forfeit immediate advancement to wing command. Fraternization between captain and newly sworn line personnel remains prohibited unless command structure is altered. Sergeant Ruzel has indicated willingness to take field command of 3rd Line Spear at next rotation, should you request reassignment to company physician oversight. Daniel stared at Ruzel. You what? Ruzel shrugged one shoulder. You reorganize one battlefield and everyone assumes change is possible. The shelter went very quiet. Serel looked at Daniel then, really looked, and all the things she would never say in front of command were there in the restraint with which she held herself still. A future if they wanted it, not free, not clean, real. Serel said, "This decision will not be made for you." Daniel laughed softly, because if he didn't he might not get breath enough to speak. That's new. No one smiled, though Ruzel came closest. Serel was the one who answered first. "I accept the cost," she said. Not to Serel, to Daniel. His chest tightened so sharply it was almost pain. A month ago he had wanted a bunk and a border stamp. Now the woman he loved was offering him not romance as escape but life as burden shared, and trusting him enough not to soften what it would demand. He thought of ambulance nights and freight corridors, and all the places he had been useful without ever quite belonging. He thought of Serel's hand on his wrist in the storm shelter, counting him back into himself. He thought of Ruzel driving him toward the breach because apparently some people under duress became exactly who they had been waiting to be. "I accept too," Daniel said. He turned to Serel. "If the offer stands." "It stands," Serel said. Then to Ruzel, because she seemed the sort of sergeant from whom entire lives might require practical clearance. "You sure about the command rotation?" Ruzel's mouth tilted. "I have been ready for years. Your arrival merely made it bureaucratically interesting." That finally got a small breath of laughter from Serel. Serel stepped aside. "Then the matter is concluded. 3rd Line Spear will swear its medic at dawn." The ceremony took place on the ridge above camp, under a sky gone clear after the last storm. 3rd Line Spear stood in 2 lines facing inward, armor polished, cyan elements lit low in the morning dim. Daniel wore field gray with a new insignia patch still stiff from issue. He had slept very little, not from fear. Ruzel, now acting field captain by order pending rotation, oversaw the oath with the gravity of someone who understood exactly when humor improved an event and when it did not. Serel witnessed. Linu grinned openly every time Daniel looked her way until Ruzel cut that off with a glance sharp enough to shave wire. When it was time, Serel stepped forward not as captain but as line physician designate, the command markings removed from her collar. Without them she looked no less formidable, just different, nearer. She held in her hands a roll of white pressure bandage. Daniel felt his heart beat in his throat. "In line service," Serel said, voice carrying over the ridge. "We bind what is broken, we support what bears weight, and we do not let the living stand alone when steadiness can be shared." It was not old law, Daniel realized, or not entirely. Some of it was hers. She took his wrist. The same place every time. Once weeks ago in a wreck, once in a storm shelter, once at the edge of a memorial circle, now here in daylight with witnesses and consequences and no distance left to pretend at. Serel wrapped the bandage once around his wrist, firm and clean, then handed him the roll. Daniel swallowed, took her hand and wrapped her wrist in turn. The white against her muted green skin and dark bronze sleeve looked less like restraint than promise. When the oath was done, when Salen had signed the standing papers and Ruzel had informed him with excessive pleasure that dawn inventory began in 30 minutes, and line medics did not get sentimental exemptions, the company dispersed with the efficient tact of soldiers granting privacy by pretending not to. Daniel and Serel remained on the ridge. Wind moved softly through the loose ends of her long braids. In the morning light, her eyes were less luminous than at night, more clearly blue, and somehow that simple fact made her seem even more unreal to him. "So," he said, "I accidentally joined your combat unit." Serel's mouth curved. "No. No. You did that by mistake." She stepped closer, close enough that the wrapped white bandage on her wrist brushed his sleeve. "This part, Daniel Reyes, you did on purpose." He looked at her for a long moment. "Good." "Good," she agreed. There were still rules, rotations, war. She would take medical oversight at next cycle, Ruzel the field line, and nothing about the frontier would stop being dangerous just because they had finally stopped lying to themselves. The cost remained the cost. But it had shape now, chosen shape. Daniel lifted his hand, slow enough to give her all the time in the world to refuse. Serel answered by placing her fingers in his. "Breathe with me," she said softly. He smiled. "You're stealing my material." "It is now line procedure." "In for 4. In for 4. They stood on the ridge above the waking camp, hands linked, and counted together. Then Daniel bent and kissed her once, gently, in the clean cold of morning, and when she kissed him back there was no urgency in it at all. Only certainty. When they finally parted, Linu shouted from below that the new medic was due in triage if he intended to save the galaxy before breakfast. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Your people are impossible." Serel's expression turned thoughtful. "I was given to understand that quality was human." "Fair." She squeezed his hand once and let go. "Come on, then." Down below them waited wounded soldiers, inventory chaos, frontier weather, and 5 years of a life he had never imagined wanting. Daniel looked at Serel, at the disciplined line of her body, the luminous calm of her face, the dark spiral of braided hair and the white bandage bright at her wrist, and felt the old, familiar fear of everything worth keeping. This time he followed it anyway.